year to the native people. And the more elite members of the society were supposed to pay more than one peck. Now, we don't use pecks much anymore. It's approximately 2 gallons of corn. So it's not a huge amount, but it's a symbolic recognition of native sovereignty. And then finally, there was an agreement that the English could return to the homes that they had abandoned during King Philip's War, but they were not supposed to build more. They were not supposed to expand their settlement. And when they were deciding how to kind of regulate that, the English proposed that the native people remain 10 miles away from the English at all times. And they decided that that really wasn't the best way to go about it. They needed some kind of geographical marker. So they basically drew a line dividing English and Indian settlement and set it at the western limits of Casco Bay. Now, these terms are interesting to think about as a baseline. This idea that native people have sovereignty over both their land and their selves. So their sovereignty over their land is, of course, reflected in tribute, and their sovereignty over themselves is reflected in the fact that they get to carry out justice against their own people, not have to submit to English justice. Those terms were common throughout the region earlier in the 17th century. In my first book called Subjects Unto the Same King, I talk about the way that initial agreements between native people and English people actually preserved this idea of reciprocity. Only with the rapid expansion of English population and a number of conflicts between native and English people did that reciprocity start slipping. And by the time King Philip's War breaks out, it's essentially gone. The English expect the native people to submit to their authority on a local basis. And the native people try to push back against it with various diplomatic and other means, and when that fails, the result is King Philip's War. So why are these terms still in place after King Philip's War in Maine? It has everything to do with the ratio of native to English people. By the end of King Philip's War, even at the start actually of King Philip's War, down in southern New England, native people only make up about 15% of the population, the total population. And by the end of the war, that's been reduced to about 8% through death and exile from the region. In Maine and New Hampshire, it's quite different. There are about 10,000 English settlers and about 3,000 native people. That's a much different ratio. And as a result, the English feel that they need to continue respecting native ways, at least on paper. It doesn't always happen in practice. And the native people had been very successful in driving English people out of their settlements during King Philip's War. Many towns throughout Maine and New Hampshire were abandoned, and the settlers ended up going down into southern New England, staying in places like Salem, for instance, for years sometimes. That success is what allowed the native people to demand the kind of terms that they do at the end of King Philip's War. One writer in the 19th century on Maine, William Williamson, had this to say about that outcome. Though the close of King Philip's War in Maine was the cause of universal joy, the terms of peace were generally considered by the English to be of a disgraceful character. Nevertheless, preferable to a predatory warfare and its consequent deprivations and calamities. Nor were the exactions of the Sagamores unjust. The Aborigines, it was acknowledged, had a possessory right to the country. Large tracts had been taken from the Sokokis, the Anasagunticook, and the Cannabas tribes, as well by encroachment as by purchase. And their remarkable successes through the late war might very properly embolden them to dictate these hard conditions of peace. So the people agreeing to or kind of carrying out this treaty were English peace commissioners and native sagamores. Ordinary people on the ground, of course, didn't usually have the opportunity to consent to these terms, and many of the settlers in Maine and New Hampshire did not agree to the terms and didn't follow those stipulations. So, as I've mentioned, there's kind of a baseline in all of New England that gradually goes away in southern New England, but persists in Maine and New Hampshire because of the relative ratio of population. We see a desire on the part of both the native people and the English people to maintain a relationship. So even though the natives had been quite successful in driving the English out of Maine at the end of King Philip's War, representatives of the various native groups go to Boston and seek to make treaties at the end of the war. They want to reestablish relationships with the English. Why is that? Well, there are a number of reasons. One is there's a mutual desire for trade and alliance. Now, trade's kind of self-explanatory. The native people had things the English settlers wanted. Furs, for instance. The English people had things the native people wanted, including guns and ammunition, so that they could carry out hunting in the way that had become more efficient and desirable to them. So trade was something they wanted to continue. In this period, in fact, there's something that happens that I call de-skilling. Of course, before the English settlers came, native people had used bows and arrows to do their hunting and other methods. But once they get access to European guns, they find that they're more effective. They can hunt more easily. And so they transition to hunting in that way. Well, that creates a little bit of a dilemma, and that is that they stop making bows and arrows, and the skill gets lost. A few people retain it, but the younger people are growing up with using these European weapons. As a result, they become somewhat reliant on the English for these weapons. They're not able to produce them themselves. In some cases, they can repair them, but often they have to go to English blacksmiths to get them repaired. And so if the English have a desire to kind of punish the native people for whatever encroachments they may have done, they will refuse to supply powder and ammunition, and they will refuse to repair guns. And in some cases, they will demand that native people surrender their guns. So this is just to give you an idea of how reliant the native people have become. And as a result, they really want to maintain those ties of trade. Well, what about alliance? Alliance is a really interesting subject in this time. In my first book, I talk about the 1621 treaty between the Pilgrims at Plymouth and the native people of that region, which turns out to be quite a reciprocal agreement. And one of the things that I find in documents that follow that agreement that's really interesting is the fact that the native people and the English people interpret the treaty differently. The native people believe that the entire treaty is reciprocal, including justice, reciprocal justice, and various stipulations about whether you can carry guns into a town, for instance. The English people, on the other hand, think that only part of it is reciprocal, and over time they decide that basically they're in a superior position, not in a position of friendship. But when the treaty was first made, it is laid out as a friendship. And in fact, at the end of the treaty, it says that if the English say to the native people, if you agree to these terms, then King James will esteem you as his friend and ally. Now, friend is a term that in many documents of this time period is a signal that this is an alliance, not a subjection, not a situation in which one party is above the other, but a mutual alliance. Native people continue to interpret many of those treaties over the 17th century as mutual, not a superior-inferior relationship. And that is certainly true of 17th century Maine. That they think that when they enter into alliances with English people, they're not necessarily submitting themselves to local English authority. That's what the English want. They want to have immediate jurisdiction over the native people in their region. The native people, when they agree to a submission to the king, sometimes use these terms. They say, we are subjects unto the same king, which is a way of saying, you're a subject, I'm a subject. We're both in submission to the king, who's so far away that he really doesn't have much to say to us. So it's kind of an equality, and they persist in interpreting things that way. So what do you do when you submit to a far away king? Basically, you're saying, I will give you my loyalty in exchange for your protection. So what might that protection be? For many Native people, they seek protection against their enemies, who are often Native people. So, for instance, among the Pennacook of New Hampshire, they were very frightened of being attacked by the Mohawk. And part of their agreement with the English to become allies was that the English would protect them from these Native enemies. Another thing that they do is that they seek protection against local English authority. So just to reiterate, they consider themselves equal subjects of the crown. And therefore, when local English people say, give us your guns, or you have to do this, or you have to send your people to us for justice, there's a frequent pattern of Native people in New England appealing to the crown for relief against this assertion of authority on a local level. So we've got these treaties that are being established, and when they get established, including the treaty that ends King Philip's War, there are certain expectations that English people would respect Native sovereignty and Native landways. Let me illustrate that with some documents. So there's a very interesting submission that takes place in 1684. An unnamed English official who represents the crown goes up to visit with various Wabanaki Indian groups and asks them if they want to submit to the crown. And they all say yes, they are very interested in submitting to the crown. And they have a discussion, and this royal authority says that he takes down their words as closely as he can. So he's basically taking dictation from the Sagamores. And this is what he says they say. The Wabanakis declared, quote, since our authority over our own people to exercise of our hereditary rights and ancient traditions and customs are the only means to keep them in obedience and to enable us to serve your majesty, we humbly crave the continuance thereof. So let's look at that first part again. They are saying that they want the king to allow them to retain their authority over their own people. And then they say, we most humbly offer entire subjection and obedience to your glorious crown, praying your gracious protection. Now, to a modern eye, and maybe even to contemporary English people, this seems like a complete contradiction. How can you maintain sovereignty or authority over your own people and offer entire subjection and obedience to the crown? Well, to Native people, that wasn't such a contradiction. They believed that submitting to the king was kind of like submitting to a paramount Sagamore. So a Sagamore who might have authority over many groups. But when they made a submission to a paramount Sagamore, they retained their authority over their own people. And the Sagamore was not supposed to interfere in that local authority. So this was kind of the way that they visualized this. Now, the English, on the other hand, wanted that submission to be not just to the crown, but to local English authorities as well. There's a historian named Richard White who has talked about a concept called creative misunderstanding. And he noticed that in many documents and interchanges between Native people and Europeans in this early American period, you get these kinds of contradictions where one group understands something one way and the other party understands them in a completely different way. And he basically says that they're operating on this basis of creative misunderstanding. They're allowing those different understandings to coexist. Because they value having the relationship, they're willing to kind of look the other way. They don't think it's a deal breaker, and they allow it to stand. So that's an interesting way to look at this, that what seems to be a contradiction is allowed to stand according to the Native interpretation because both parties see the relationship as valuable. So another way to look at this creative misunderstanding is through Native landways. So the same year and in almost the same meeting where this submission takes place in 1684, there's also a confirmation of a Native land deed. It's the Pejepscot lands are deeded by certain Native Sagamores to Richard Wharton, a land speculator, in 1684. And here again, the wording of the deed seems contradictory. So it says that the Indians made full and absolute resignation and confirmation to Mr. Wharton and his heirs forever. So that sounds like what the English want, which is complete surrender of all rights, absolute resignation of everything to do with the land. But in this very same deed, the Native people assert their, quote, hereditary rights and ancient traditions and customs, including liberty of hunting or fishing and hunting and improvement of our ancient planting grounds. So here's a deed in which they are absolutely resigning their ownership to Richard Wharton, and at the same time insisting that they can continue hunting, fishing, and planting their crops on the land that they have deeded to him. That reservation of traditional rights is something you can see over and over in early land deeds in southern New England. But by the time that King Philip's War breaks out, it stops. The English people have attained such a kind of unequal ratio of population and so much power over the local natives that they refuse to allow them to reserve these rights anymore. Now, what are these rights? It's basically a shared land use. And that's the way that most Native English exchanges of property in the early period were. This understanding that the natives retained their sovereignty over the land, but allowed the English to come onto it and use it. Use it for building, use it for hunting. But the natives got to do the same thing. They shared those various uses of the land. Now, as I said, that stops in southern New England, but it continues in Maine and New Hampshire up into this period. So what happens after the Treaty of 1678? As I mentioned, the ordinary people don't sign this treaty. They don't get any right to approve of it or not, and that applies to both natives and English settlers. And very soon after the treaty is decided, there's a real breakdown of obedience to that treaty, including failure to provide mutual protection, failure of reciprocal justice, and a lack of respect. Let me give you some examples of that. So this is a really interesting letter. It's in the New Hampshire archives, and it's a letter from John Hawkins, also known as Kankamagus, to the governor of New Hampshire at the time, a man named Edward Cranfield. This is in 1685, so it's about 6 years after the treaty has been signed, 6 or 7 years. He writes to him to complain about the fact that he is suffering repeated attacks from Mohawk Indians, their enemies. He says that he is afraid always Mohawks. He will kill me every day and night. So this is very much written in the dialect of a native person who is speaking a second language. He's speaking this English language, and it's being written by a native scribe, not an English scribe. The native scribe is the first one to sign under the name John Hodkins. It's Simon Batokum. He had been trained in writing and reading the English language by John Eliot, the minister to the Indians down in southern New England. And he is living with the Pennacook at this point, and he writes this down. So why are the Mohawks being allowed to attack the Pennacook in this instance? And why isn't Governor Cranfield protecting them? The promise of protection from enemy attacks was part of that treaty. Well, there's an even darker side to a failure to protect. In fact, Cranfield had arranged for the Mohawks to attack the Wabanaki Indians. A couple of years earlier, there had been rumors of New England Indians attacking in southern New England. And when he heard the rumors, he went to Governor Dongan of New York and asked him to secure the Mohawks as allies and get them to attack the Wabanaki Indians. Dongan was reluctant at first and said, I don't want to do that. It's going to upset our relations with those Indians. And I'll only do it if you can prove that there have been attacks in southern New England. Well, an attack took place, not clear if it was Eastern Indians or Wabanakis or some other groups, but he went back and said, see, here's proof. And Dongan followed through and had the Mohawks start attacking the Pennacooks. So clearly, this is a terrible violation of that promise of mutual protection, actually sicking the Mohawks on the Wabanakis. That letter took place in May of 1685. John Hawkins had come with 14 other Native people to visit Edward Cranfield and to complain about these attacks. He sent that letter into Edward Cranfield and asked for a meeting, and Cranfield refused to meet with him. So over the next 24 hours, Hawkins actually has, Simon Batokum write 3 additional letters, which have additional complaints in them. This is the third of the 4 letters. And in this one, he complains that some of his native subjects, his own Pennacook people, had been punished by Cranfield, that they had done something wrong, and he had punished them. Rather than going to John Hodkins and complaining that his people had harmed English and ensuring that Hodgkins punished them, he did the punishment himself. And that was a violation of native sovereignty. I don't know if you can read this letter, but the wording is very interesting. He said, if my Indians do you long, he says long, it means wrong. And it's an interesting example that among speakers of the Wabanaki language, R wasn't used. So rather than saying wrong, they used long. Pray you no put your law, because some of my Indians steal, some men much love drink. He know what he do. So again, it's this kind of broken English being recorded by Simon Batokum. So he's basically saying that if Indians were under the influence of alcohol, they shouldn't be held responsible for some mischief that they might have carried out in an English community. And even if they were, Hodgkins should be the one to punish them. He says here, I will punish him. And then he ends with, you, my friend, if you desire my business, then send me and I will help you if I can. So he's reiterating the need for reciprocal justice and reminding Cranfield, he does it in his second letter as well, of the long-standing agreement and alliance between the Pennacookes and the English. And interestingly, he says that his grandfather had made that treaty. And in fact, a treaty was made clear back in 1644. And that his grandfather understood that treaty to be a covenant. And then he says, a covenant we friend always. So he's basically saying this is not a subjection of the native people to English authority. This is a mutual alliance, a covenant, making us always friends. Now, there's another interesting thing I want to point out about this letter here. When you look at the bottom, it says Mr. John Hawkins. Now, as I said, 4 different letters get sent over this 24-hour period. And this is the first one where Hawkins signs his name with Mr. Now, that's significant because in the 17th century, Mr. was not a common address for people to use. The only people who used that term Mr. were the elites. So if you signed with Mr., that meant that you were maybe a lawyer or a minister. Native people picked up on that. They picked up on the fact that Mr. was an honorable term. And so the Sagamore, the head of the Pennacookes, starts using that term. And it seems to be, in a way, out of frustration. He's being put off and put off and put off by Edward Cranfield, who won't meet with him. And this assertion, Mr., is a way of saying, I am a person who deserves respect. You need to respect me. And he does not get that respect. So that's an example of the slipping that's taking place. Those terms of the Treaty of 1678 are not being observed. There are other places that are slipping. One is the English are not paying that tribute. It's not much to pay, a peck of corn a year, but they're not paying it. Now, in this case, the exception proves the rule. Walter Gendall was a very interesting person who lived in 17th century Maine and in fact lived in North Yarmouth at the end of his life. And Gendall had had quite a bit of experience with warfare during King Philip's War and interactions with native people. He did pay the tribute. He made a point of paying the tribute. And as a result, in 1684, when there are grumblings among the native people because of the failure to abide by the treaty, rumors start spreading that they are sending to the French in Canada for powder and ammunition, and that they mean to attack the English and drive them out of their towns. Well, around the time that those rumors are going around, the native people send a message to Walter Gendall and warn him that there is an impending attack. Now that is really interesting because that is an example of that promise of mutual protection. When you promise that you'll protect from mutual attacks, you also promise that if someone is going to attack, you will give word of it. And because Walter Gendall had agreed by the treaty, he gets a warning in 1684 that the native people are going to attack and he ought to make himself scarce. Another violation, and really the biggest violation, is expansion onto native lands. So this is a picture of a marker, historic Yarmouth, and it has a map. You've probably all seen this marker. It has a map of the neck and the river, been called various rivers, including Royal River. This was located, this first town of North Yarmouth was located in Casco Bay. And if you remember, the line that was drawn at the end of this Treaty of 1678 said, natives live on the other side of the line at the extreme western edge of Casco Bay. English live on the western side. Did I say that wrong? Natives on the eastern side, English on the western side. North Yarmouth, which gets planted in 1680, is on the eastern side. It is squarely in the middle of Casco Bay. So North Yarmouth becomes a particular focus of Native grievances. They protest against people who are building. They complain to English authorities. They sometimes attack their livestock or their dogs. There are various attempts to push back against this settlement, which they see as a violation of the treaty. Finally, in August of 1688, lots of rumors of wars have been heard, and the English decide that they need to build garrisons. So a garrison is, of course, a fortified house where people can go and protect or take refuge against native attacks. And they start building a garrison on both sides of that river. The native people are very angry that they are building these garrisons because they see every building in North Yarmouth as a violation of the treaty, and here they are building 2 more, and these are garrison houses. When I was in North Yarmouth back in 2005, I noticed this sign, Garrison Lane, and I assume, I don't know for sure, but I assume that that's in reference to those garrisons that were built around that time. That was the focus of a great deal of Native unhappiness, and they start attacking the English, who are quickly trying to finish building those garrisons. And in the attacks, Walter Gendall is in fact killed. He's one of the first people killed in King William's War. This is 4 years after he had gotten the warning, but he's busy trying to respond to this attack and ends up getting shot and killed. So I thought it'd be interesting to share with you a contemporary explanation of the causes of King William's War, which kind of reiterates what I've been talking about. This was written by Reverend John Pike of New Hampshire, and he wrote a letter to Cotton Mather, the famous minister from Massachusetts, from Boston. Cotton Mather wrote a book called Decennium Luctuosum, which basically means Decade of Sorrows, all about King William's War. And he asked various people to tell him what had happened. And so Reverend Pike writes him a letter. And in it he says that the Eastern Indians, it says pretend, which is not our modern meaning of pretend. It's more like they give out these reasons for the late quarrel against the English, which began this long and bloody war. So here are the reasons the Wabanaki give. Because the English refused to pay that yearly tribute of corn agreed upon in the Articles of Peace formerly concluded with them. 2, because they were invaded in their fishery at Saco River by certain gentlemen who stopped the fish from coming up the river with their nets and seines. This they were greatly affronted at, saying they thought, though the English had got away their lands as they had, yet the fishery of the rivers had been a privilege reserved entire unto themselves. So that's that shared land use again. This idea that, yes, they had sold the land to the English, but they expected their traditional rights to continue. 3, because they were abused by the English in suffering, if not turning, their cattle over to a certain island to destroy their corn. So the English had failed to keep their livestock from running loose in native fields. But the 4th and main provocation was the granting or patenting of their lands to some English, at which they were greatly enraged, threatening the surveyor to knock him on the head if he came to lay out any lands there. Knock him on the head means kill him. So this is referring to that expansion. There were some native Sagamores who signed deeds selling lands to English settlers. The problem was they didn't get the agreement of all the native people who had claims to that land or who had traditionally used that land. So it was not considered a legitimate sale. I want to end with one more quote from Reverend Pike, which shows that there were people at the time who recognized that the failure to abide by the terms of the treaty and to respect native sovereignty was what had led to the war, and that it would have been better to offer that respect. So he asks a rhetorical question. He says, is the idea that the Indians, because pagans, have no title to any lands at all in this country, be not the way to continue the friendship of the Indians to us? And whether after all the hard censures we have undergone, the world will not judge us the juster and more righteous of the two, who own they have, though pagans, a just right to all their lands, but those which they have by fair contract and just conquest parted with. So he's basically saying there are people who say Native people have no title to lands because they are not Christian. In fact, Governor Andros, who comes in with the Glorious Revolution, makes that claim. But he says there are other people who acknowledge the right of the Native people to their lands and say they cannot be taken unless by fair contract or just conquest. Unfortunately, the people who believed the prior, the idea that natives did not have that title, were the ones who got their way in this particular time, and the consequence was King William's War. Thank you for listening, and I'd be very happy to entertain any questions.
Great, thank you so much. We do have one question to start. Anyone else wants to weigh in with a question, please pop it in the chat box. But the question is, could you please talk about the primary and secondary sources pertaining to the Treaty of Casco?
The Treaty of Casco is described in Decennium Luctuosum. So that's that account of King William's War that Cotton Mather makes. And it's also described in the letter, which is a document within a document. It's Reverend Pike's letter that appears in that book. I heard a rumor that it had also been printed in a text, a kind of a 19th century text called Neil's New England, but I was never able to find a copy of that. So if any of you know about that, let me know.
Someone else asked about the titles of your books.
What they are?
What they are, yeah.
Oh, okay. My first book is called Subjects Unto the Same King. So it's emphasizing that idea about the ways Native people perceived their relationships. The subtitle is Indians, English, and the Contest of Authority in Colonial New England. And that was published by University of Pennsylvania Press in 2005 and later in paperback in 2007. It's available on Amazon. My second book is called Swindler Sachem, the American Indian who sold his birthright, dropped out of Harvard, and conned the King of England. And that was published by Yale University Press in 2018. Also available on Amazon.
Next question here is, what can you tell us about the Presumpscot River as a fishing ground, a planting ground, and a boundary between Wabanaki and colonists?
A better person to tell you about that, but I'll tell you who you could consult with is Lisa Brooks. Lisa Brooks is a historian who, she's also of Abenaki descent, and she, in her first book called The Common Pot, talks about the fact that Native people organized their kin groups and their land boundaries along rivers, that rivers were really important in terms of kind of locating where each group had the right to hunt and plant and settle. And so she talks about that at great length in that book, and it's a very interesting book. I'd recommend it.
Does the conclusion of King William's War basically extend to Maine, the King Philip's War settlement from southern New England?
That's a good question. I would say no. Certainly the terms may be similar, but at the conclusion of King William's War, you still have a ratio that is more favorable to Native people in Maine and New Hampshire than it is in southern New England. And so they're able to push back against English settlement even after King William's War. So North Yarmouth is kind of the, that's where the King William's War starts. it's 30 years before North Yarmouth is able to get resettled. So not until 1727 does North Yarmouth begin settlement again on the neck that was illustrated in that map. And the reason that they can't do it before then is because of Native people pushing back against English settlement. So regardless of what the terms are, the conclusion of the war is still more favorable toward Native people than the war in southern New England.
Okay, a lot of questions here. Do you know where in Yarmouth the Indian encampment was at this time?
I don't actually. That's an interesting question. I'm going to reference Lisa Brooks again. She wrote a second book called Our Beloved Kin, which was about King Philip's War. And in it, she tries to reconstruct Native homelands based on things like trails and the rivers where Native people considered their homelands, and so she speculates on where a number of Native groups may have lived, and there's some persuasive speculation, but the documents and the oral history that has come down through Wabanaki peoples is not as exact as we would like it to be. So we don't know all of those. There are certain places that we can identify and others that we just can't.
So along those same lines, in addition to Lisa Brooks, who are the most active historians of this era right now? Who else should we talk to or read to learn more?
Okay, one who's done a lot of work is Tad Baker. His formal name is Emerson Woods Baker. He lives in Maine, but he teaches at Salem State College. And he has written, 4 or 5 different books about witchcraft in the region, about King William's War, about William Phipps, who came from Maine. He's also an archaeologist, and he's done a lot of really interesting work, digs in southern Maine and in northern New Hampshire. Number of articles also that he's written, one in connection with John Reed, who's a retired historian from Canada, who's also written some really interesting books about this period. One that I particularly like is called, let's see if I can remember the name exactly, Maine, Charles II, and I can't remember. I would have to look it up. But it's really good on 17th century Maine. So Tad Baker, John Reed, Lisa Brooks, Chris Bilodeau is another historian who wrote his dissertation on the Wabanaki and their various strategies for dealing with Europeans, English and French, in the 17th and 18th century. That dissertation has not yet been published, but hopefully it will be soon.
Great, thank you. Lots of great resources there. Let's see. How active were the French in these conflicts?
That's a really interesting question. There were rumors that the French had participated in King Philip's War, but there's not a whole lot of evidence that they did. That starts changing with King William's, King George's, and then the wars that take place all through the 18th century. The French are very eager to use Native people as allies against the English in the almost nonstop wars that take place between French and English empires during this time period. So they're recruiting allies. They are trying to nurture trade ties, give gifts to keep these allies in place. And so there are lots of accounts during King William's War and later wars of French and Native people allying with each other. Now, that said, I want to make an important distinction, and that is that King William's War, which breaks out in 1688, is a native English war. It is not an imperial war. Lots of the wars that take place in New England in this time have New England names and European names. And King William's War is the New England name. In Europe, it's known as the War of the League of Augsburg, or the 9 Years' War. It is said to have lasted from 1689 and then for the next 9 years. Starts in 1688 in New England. And I want to make that point because it shows that New England Indians, Wabanaki, were not just pawns in imperial schemes. They were fighting wars with the English and sometimes with the French for their own reasons and to defend their own rights. Sometimes these wars get kind of absorbed into larger imperial conflicts, but many of them start out for native reasons, not imperial ones. Back to the question about the French, though. One of the really interesting things to look at in this period is the negotiation that's taking place between Native people and English and Native people and French over who they're going to ally with. And often it comes down to who can offer the best trade goods. And in this period, the English are consistently able to offer better trade goods. However, the English are encroaching on native land. So for that reason, the natives have an incentive to go and seek alliance with the French. And the French capitalize on this. There are a number of documents that talk about the French meeting with native people and saying, the English are on your land, you won't be able to be sovereign unless you can drive them off. And in this way, they are able to recruit them as allies.
Okay, to take a few more?
Sure.
Okay. Let's see. Was King Philip active at all in Maine and New Hampshire, or is the Maine conflict called King Philip's War because it's contemporaneous with the southern New England conflicts?
A very good observation. We don't have any evidence that King Philip or Metacom ever went up to New Hampshire or Maine. He does go to New York. He spends a good chunk of the war up in New York, but seeking alliances with native groups up there to try to help him in the war effort. He does not succeed. He tries to seek alliance from Mohawk people, and instead they attack him. And he has to retreat back to New England. Yes, it's a matter of the overlap. It may be that the Wabanaki were aware of what was going on, and well, I know that they were aware of what was going on, but it may be that they used the attacks on the English in southern New England as a good opportunity to push back against English encroachments in Maine and New Hampshire.
Can you talk about Weedamoo and the role of women in leadership during King Philip's War?
Weedamoo was a female sachem. Some people might refer to her as a squaw sachem. Where I come from in the West, that's a term that we try not to use because it's offensive to local Native people. But I have noticed that in New England, it's still used. In fact, even as a term of honor, the Nipmuc Indian leader, when she's female, is known as the squaw sachem. So she was an example of that. There was a surprising number of women like Weedamoo who were leaders in this time period. And there's been a long-standing debate about what that means. What does it mean that there were women like Weedamoo who exercised authority over the males in their tribes, who had decision-making power, who got to agree about whether or not their people would go to war? Does this mean that women enjoyed more equality in Native groups than in English groups, for instance, and other European groups? And I've heard people make that argument that in fact, it's an evidence of Native women's higher status compared to Europeans. I've also heard people make the argument that the fact that women were in positions of authority had a lot to do with the depopulation that takes place in 17th century New England. We believe that up to 90% of the Native people died because of exposure to European diseases, but also because of starvation and warfare and the various problems that come with European encroachment. So people who think that that depopulation led people in Native groups to turn to women who were in kind of the royal line because of the deaths of males in the line. That's again one of the arguments. But during the course of King Philip's War, Weetamoo and a few other women do act very much like the male sachems or sagamores act, in terms of the decision-making power they have, the ability they have to lead people or to direct people to go into battle. And I remember speaking with an anthropologist at the University of, at Boston University, University of Massachusetts at Boston a few years ago. And he said that regardless of whether the frequency of having female sachems in this period was affected by population or other factors, when they did become sachems, he said it was their gender becomes irrelevant, essentially. That they are no longer seen as women, they are seen as sachems with all the same power and authority that a male sachem might have.
Right, so many good questions coming in, but I think we have time for just one more so we can keep it to our hour talk. Great question here about sources. Where are some of the original treaties and other deed documents that you found? Where are those kept?
They're largely kept in the state archives. That's where I spent most of my time doing my research. The Maine Historical Society, am I thinking the right one? Yes, has a wonderful archive in Portland with all kinds of collections of deeds and treaties and documents and letters and you name it. In addition to that, in the 19th century, there was a collection made, a documentary history of the state of Maine, that it's a multi-volume set where they went to these manuscript documents and transcribed them and then printed them in these books. And those are available probably in a number of libraries in the area. They're really wonderful, all kinds of great documents. So you can go to archives and see the originals. You can see collected, transcribed versions of documents. And because a lot of these collections were done in the 19th century, they're out of copyright, which means you can get on the Internet Archive or Google Books and search for those and get access to those. So that's really helpful. I thought I'd throw this in because it's interesting. One thing to be aware of if you decide to go to an archive, like the Maine Historical Society or the Maine State Archives or the New Hampshire Archives, is that the way that archives organize their documents it varies widely from place to place, and it's not always logical. So for instance, in my second book, Swindler Sachem, which is about a Nipmuc Indian man named John Wampus, who just lives a fascinating life, visits the king, appeals to the crown in London against Massachusetts. Anyway, I found out about John Wampus in the Maine Historical Society archives. John Wampus never set foot in Maine. So why were the documents about various court cases he was involved in Maine? Well, the reason was that the magistrate who tried him was Daniel Lucan, and the Maine State Historical Society archives have what's called an autograph file, where they have famous people, documents that are there just because a famous person signed them, not because they have anything to do with Maine history. So if you go to the archives, you might find some unusual treasures. And I guess the same would go for going to other archives and maybe finding some treasures about Maine.
That's great. Thanks so much. It's always an adventure.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Thank you for your questions. And most of all, thank you, Dr. Pulsipher, for sharing this great talk today. Lots of wonderful research and ideas and directions to take next.
No, you're very welcome. It was a pleasure.
Thanks, everyone, and have a great night.